This is a tour of the keyword lexicon I developed while building my personal knowledge base. I use it to tag the content of quotations taken from a wide variety of sources. While it might seem at first like an undifferentiated mass of text, you can see that many of the keywords have been clustered together using slashes and semicolons. In the interest of time, let's focus on a representative sampling. Grouping them further makes it easier to see the inherent structure of the lexicon and the relationship between keywords. While it's possible to convert the lexicon into a hierarchy or narrative, as I'm doing here, I'd also like to emphasize that keywords are valuable precisely because they resist such categories and sequences, as I'll try to illustrate throughout by emphasizing alternative relationships between keywords using boldface. Let us begin with space. Or more accurately, spatiality. Not just abstract theoretical space, but the experience of dwelling within it, and all that that entails. From the perspective of the inhabitant, abstract space takes on a somewhat negative charge. The idea of emptiness already carries the suggestion of a more subjective experience of loss, lack, and absence. Often it seems as if subjectivity arrives even before anyone or anything makes a proper entrance. With entrances and arrivals come exits and departures, and the phenomena of movement and transportation through which we come to comprehend space in the abstract. The very act of filling space conveys force, power, and strength, as we observe in the movements of the planets and the fixity of the stars. Gravitational centers, points that inscribe patterns, and points around which patterns get inscribed. We might cite Albert Einstein here, but at the risk of generalizing his theories of relativity, when all we really mean is a force, cosmic or imaginative, that marks space with various boundaries, limits, portals, and horizons. With luminous centers and obscure peripheries, and so many shades along the spectrum of light and darkness, with seemingly infinite folds and layers to confuse the boundaries that once seemed clearly inscribed. This complexity of space giving rise to feelings of liquidity, fluidity, immersion, submersion, floating, drowning, falling, flying, and suspension, which are of course figures for the way such spaces are experienced by biological life, with its layered systems of perception and folded patterns of DNA, and the folding and layering of such organisms within the ecosystem of nature. A system that redoubles the movements and patterns of abstract space on a new level of concentration and complexity, making it possible to talk about something like evolution, to speak of mutation, distortion, and deformity, and to recoil from these movements as if they were monstrous. Perhaps this only happens when humans begin studying humans, asserting what it means to be human, and in doing so, redefining nature in terms of what is natural vis-a-vis the human. We might define humans as a form of life grounded in the experience of live birth and the long interval of nurture, or as a species with a complicated understanding of gender and the codes of behavior this implies, however obscurely, capable of feeling the discomfort of transgression as if it were a part of space itself, in order to maintain the proper distance between friends and neighbors, and the proper closeness within and between families. The social spaces that emerge from the experience of having bodies and being embodied, how we stand in relation to other bodies, how we grow attached to them, how we handle their demise, how we stand with ourselves, with others, and within each other, within space, how this changes the meaning of our former nudity and the levels of our self-concealment, how we are forced from spaces both physically and socially, how we are confined to spaces and overcome the confines of spaces, how these bodily experiences can drive us out of our heads, so to speak, how the boundaries between mental and physical space define our fitness to be around others, our sanity, which raises the question of whether the mind dwells within this fabric of embodied social spaces or lies radically and transcendently beyond it. Whether our ability to incorporate increasingly complex technologies into ourselves redefines the natural capacities of the species as a whole. Whether this prosthetic impulse promotes an idea of human nature that is defined against the wilderness of nature, the system of complex organic relationships from which it arose. prompting us to think about how technology makes it at once easier and more difficult to control movements and boundaries between spaces. How it reconfigures our nomadic tendencies, rooting us in place. How simple tools evolve into complex machines with many replaceable parts, and how we evolve into complex machines with many replaceable parts. How mechanical reproducibility industrializes production and manufacturing. How this reveals the limits of nature as a receptacle, and forces us to think in terms of sustainability and conservation. How it forces us to wonder about the pathological effects of technology, whether it poisons even as it cures. How both medicine and industry have tended to rely on cutting into what is vital and cutting out what is harmful. How even the seas have been territorialized, together with almost all previously unexplored regions of the world. And we have yet to say anything about the most prosthetic technology of all, the language in which all of our ideas and experiences are immersed and suspended. Our pre-verbal gestures and expressions, our ability to delimit and define conceptual territories by imposing names, to interrogate the meaning and power of these names, to convey our desires as commands, to express conflicts between these desires and expand them to include beings beyond ourselves, to test the limits of our ideas and unravel their complexity with examples, to suspend judgment and convey subtlety in conditional or subjunctive modes, to strengthen our arguments by defining their scope and terminology more precisely, to extract or distort the most relevant points in summary form, to exclude the tangential ones parenthetically, all of which implies the formal structure of a written language, a grammatical code that could never simply have been born out of speech because it is ever mutating and evolving, and because structures like syntax were always already implicit in the rhythms of speech, even before they were standardized in written typography. Writing does give us the capacity to list information more expansively than speech, to form categories, hierarchies, and taxonomies, to publish and disseminate these structures more widely and effectively, to expose the tensions between the different moments of the thought process, to place our thinking in the context of larger and larger bodies of text. But while writing enhances memory prosthetically, it does not simply rid us of forgetting. The vast discrepancies in our historical records testify to this, as does the difficulty of balancing boredom and attention when we are inundated with text, and the way our hopes about the future enable us to forget the past. But this ability to extend our minds into the future is unquestionably grounded in the past, such that some of our more profound experiences of time are not of the moment, but of a more fluid duration, of anticipations and recollections revolving against the backdrop of our habits and habitats, in such a way that it becomes impossible to conceive of space and time as distinct phenomena, as Martin Heidegger has argued. Written technologies of memory also enable scholarship and teaching on a global scale, which not only implies history, but the interpretation of history, and all of the debates and criticisms about the interpretation of history. The sundry methodologies, practices, and programs of which the university is comprised, such as the study of ethics, which concerns all of the human relations covered thus far, questions of how we should behave when confronted with the otherness of one another, the political institutions that claim to ensure that ethical society is upheld, the technologies of visibility that such institutions require, especially when it comes to matters of the law, where human or technological witness is paramount, or the ethics of religion, which tend to qualify all human concerns with the hope of divine revelation, which presumes that all of our sins are legible to the divine, which sometimes values the sacred over the lives of the sacrilegious, which monumentalizes and ritualizes death, which asks that we confess so that we may be forgiven, that we address ourselves to a presence that is invisible and beyond, in various forms of prayer. Then there are business ethics, which adapt many of the aforementioned codes for the management of risk and the hazards of the market. But beneath any inquiry into ethics lies epistemology, the study of how we know what we know and whether the truth is certain, which focuses on the foundational act of positing what is true, what interferes with our perception of what is true, what causes us to distort what is true, knowingly or not, what compels us to make and keep secrets, and the implications of doing so, how ultimately truth might be regarded as a phenomenon that cannot be posited outside language, and before human history and discourse. Epistemology is also the foundation of ontology, or metaphysics, the study of being and beings, which mediates between questions of truth and ethics, that explores our understanding of cause and effect, and what forces might have set our existence in motion, whether our will is really free, and whether the self is really autonomous, how we reflect upon our behaviors and thoughts self-consciously, how we distinguish what is necessary and essential amidst the flood of accidents and contingencies, how the unanswered epistemological questions leave ontology fragmented and incomplete, how we determine what is original and whether the origins are authentic, and all of the various dialectics that seek to model the forces and movements of life, to articulate contradiction, juxtaposition, and paradox, to distinguish the materiality of what matters from the ideologies that distort it, to complicate the meaning of progress and critique utopian ideals, to uphold or revise the historical materialism of Karl Marx, to explore the ways in which the capitalist economy reifies and commodifies our labor, to critique the idea of property and ownership that this engenders, to analyze its influence on social classes and the distribution of wealth, to chart the vast constellation of forces at play in even the most discrete historical moment, as Theodor Adorno attempted in his negative Dialectics, and Walter Benjamin in his various writings on the philosophy of history. And then there's the closely related field of cultural studies, which applies a Marxist variety of dialectics to questions of race and ethnicity, as well as the conflicts between nations, and the brutal history of colonialism and empire. Then there is the dialectic developed by Freud and the psychoanalytic tradition, the dynamic interplay of the conscious and unconscious mind, the ways in which our sexualities and desires are expressed and repressed, the way trauma wounds our memory, causing recurrent symptoms of what cannot be repressed, the way jokes and laughter involuntarily reveal some of our most private thoughts and wishes, the way we project our unconscious onto other people and things, the sense of strange familiarity or uncanniness that this kind of doubling creates, the uncanniness of language, which, according to Jacques Lacan at least, is the true domain of the unconscious. And then there is the dialectic or anti-dialectic of a thinker like Friedrich Nietzsche, which questions the epistemological and linguistic foundations of history and virtually every institution, ridiculing the powers that try to civilize the depths of our uncertainty and pursuing these aporias to the point of madness, challenging the ideology and aesthetic of beauty with the ecstasy and monstrosity of the formless, and the pretensions of culture that the appreciation of beauty implies, in favor of a more embodied art like dance, and the incantatory power of music and song. In thinking about Nietzsche's aesthetics, we have already started a transition from dialectics and philosophy into literature, that strange anti-genre that defies convention, and might even be described as a property of language itself, as literariness, which includes poetry as a form and is encompassed by the original sense of poiesis, as making or creating, as well as theater and all the reflections and refractions of theatricality, fiction and all varieties of fiction about fiction, that challenge the boundary between what is real and imaginary by traversing it, that generates equally paradoxical historical categories, such as modernism and postmodernism, which tend to manipulate, if not suspend, the very temporality of written narrative, creating problems that linguists can only admire or condemn, but not resolve, because they are inherent in the very act of referring to anything that exists outside the mind, in conveying our thoughts through signs and symbols. The exploration of the various ways in which language is unmade by its own materials has become a discipline in itself, one that should not be regarded as a science or philosophy, since these are precisely the institutions under deconstruction, established by Jacques Derrida, who expanded his deconstruction of the relationship between speech and writing to anthropology, history, psychoanalysis, politics, law, and religion, and Paul de Man, who focused more acutely on literature, the history of literary criticism, and the temporality of literary language. Both were fascinated by the way language complicates reality while claiming to imitate it. The complexity of the relationship between the original reality and the written copy. The way this relationship functions like a trope, a metaphor that turns the relationship between time and space inside out. How the very authority of the originator and the origin rests on the symbolic power of language to gather all the fragmentary and contingent evidence into a figure of totality and truth. A metaphorical potential of language that can always be challenged by the metonymies from whence it sprang, the contingent and accidental associations between words and sounds that lack the aesthetic spark to become metaphors. Like the puns, jokes, and Freudian slips that end up challenging the authority of the speaker by affording a glimpse into the unwilled, unhuman mechanicity of language. The allegorical potential of language to conceal meanings that could not even be unraveled by the most skilled readers of metaphor, that reach out for the understanding of something other than the text. The irony that seems always to evade definition and genre, that resembles allegory in its ability to turn anything, anywhere, at any time into a figure of something else. The countless moments in which figures of speech go beyond their intended rhetorical effect and begin to disintegrate, but in doing so perhaps revealing a more originary linguistic force, an original catachresis at work in every act of naming and redefinition. An excess of language which might also, paradoxically, be revealed in the absence of writing, in the pauses, breaks, interruptions, and ellipses that also mean more than they can articulate. The syntax of language that speaks in circles and negations in order to avoid certain topics or to make their absence conspicuous. The uncanny power of language to grant a face and agency to the inanimate world, to personify and address it. Its equally uncanny power to reflect within and upon itself infinitely, writing about writing, speaking about writing, writing about speaking about writing, etc. Our tendency to treat this kind of excess thematically, as we're doing here, and the knack postmodern artists have for incorporating this tendency into their very works. How this kind of metafictional maneuver has the potential to short-circuit the machinery of academic production by testing the limits of intertextuality. How language at large is constantly reiterating and reconfiguring its semantic codes on a scale that so far remains incomprehensible. How so much of the mutation and evolution of language is still being erased, effaced, or deleted. How we still lack the ability to read a history of language in which each version is written atop the next, as it is in a palimpsest. How even though translation gives us some of our most powerful insights into this process, we still have not reached a point where every translation of a work can be layered and juxtaposed. Even the world's greatest archives and databases still struggle to represent this kind of intertextuality in a usable way. Even the colossal cybernetic infrastructure of the World Wide Web has yet to fully integrate and revolutionize the library. Perhaps because of the need to represent information as facts and data, free from the difficulties of literary language, treating linguistic information as a code that can be decrypted in an unambiguous way. Or because we lack the graphical means or programming skill to represent the available linguistic data in a meaningful way. The algorithms, automation, search criteria, and modeling it would require to study a language that is no longer modeled after the fixity of the page, but rather the transitoriness of streams and feeds, which are more easily parsed by the kind of keyword tags that I'm now demonstrating than the hierarchy I've forced them into for the sake of exposition. Will it someday be possible to imagine the convergence of linguistic and technological singularities? The strangeness of the literary event, each encounter in which language might be said to occur. With the advent of the technological singularity, beyond which we can no longer predict what the exponential growth of our technological capacities might render possible. Will the digital humanities play a role in this convergence? Perhaps, but only if we collaborate with the pioneers of machine learning and neural nets to ensure that the singularity of language is taken seriously. This lexicon itself is an attempt to meet the informational demands of technology without being overly thematic. If you've worked in the humanities for some time, you probably won't have learned much from this ad hoc narrative. My real hope is that you can now see how what you already know might be tagged in a way that is mutually advantageous for human and machine learning. That you can see how this lexicon models the singularity of my thought, even as it differs from your own. I encourage you all to take and modify whatever you find useful here, or create your own from scratch. Either way, I'm fascinated to see where our metadata deviate and where they converge.